Hey there, welcome back. Okay, so we are going to be talking about getting ourselves structured with writing, for example, our scripts or our bullet points or whatever. I'm going to show you how to do this using a tool called Podcast Studio Pro. I mentioned in the last video that this was a tool called Writer's Room Pro. It still is, and I helped the creator of Writer's Room Pro to spin this off into a podcast-centric offering called Podcast Studio Pro. So this is a writing and planning tool. As you can see here, it's a writer's room tool, or it started off that way, for show writers of a television and movie. Ted Lasso, for example, I'm sure everybody knows that. But now we have a podcast version of it. And when I say we, I mean we collectively as creators. I am not an owner of this company. I don't have an investment in it. I'm not an advisor. I just helped a guy who became a friend. So I'm going to use this to show you how to stay organized using a platform like Podcast Studio Pro. Your first question might be, how expensive is this? So go to pricing. For one user, which is probably all you're going to need, $10 a month. For two users, which is 2 to 100 users, it's $20 a month. So I don't think you'll need more than 100 users. So I think $20 a month is pretty good. Okay. So I'll go ahead and log in. And we're going to kind of go through the process of how to use this and how to create a podcast in it so that you can use it for yours. So you can see I have a few podcasts. That might be an understatement. I have actually more than are listed here. I'm going to create a new show, though, because you won't have a podcast here. So I'll go ahead and create a new podcast by hitting the plus sign down here in the bottom right. You may not be able to see it because my video is in the way, but you'll get this pop up and you'll title your podcast. What did we call the demo podcast from last week? We called it the Pretend Fantasy. And we'll say that the episode number to start on is 1 because we've never made one before. So episode 1, actually we'll start at 0 if we can. Oh no, we can't. 1. And we'll say, how many number of episodes do we have? Well, most people are doing an episode every week. So there's 52 weeks in a year. But you know what? Most people are taking something like Christmas off and their birthday off. So let's say we've got 50 episodes. Let's say that's what we've got. We'll also, how do we want the numbers in the tool to be displayed? Do we want it to say episode 1, 2, 3, or do we want it to say S1E1 for season 1, episode 1, or season 1, episode 2? Or do we want to use the season number and episode number together as in 101, as in season 1, episode 1, and so on and so forth? For me in particular, I like to use this style here, 101, 102, 103. And that's what I'll select here. But it's totally up to you. Now I'm going to select Add Image to be a visual representation of the podcast on the dashboard. And I don't know, I think I probably have it right here. Great. So I'll go ahead and add an image. Now, this isn't going to be seen anywhere but within the platform. So there's really no reason for you to worry about the quality of the image in this case. You can just throw something up there so you know what it is. Nobody's actually going to see this but you. But this is my podcast artwork, so I'm going to use it here. It's easy. And I'll create the podcast. And now within Podcast Studio Pro, I can see that I have Pretend Fantasy as a podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. Let's go over some basic controls. Over here on the left, we have an overview, and the overview is showing us episode 101, 102, 103, as you can see across the top. So these are vertical columns. If I don't like that view and I wanted to change it, I could change the board orientation so that we would be going this way instead. Whatever you prefer. I kind of like top to bottom, so I'll leave it this way. Underneath episodes, we have a list of all the episodes, which is the same thing we have here, but this is the overview. Under episodes, we can select a specific episode, which would be the same as clicking the arrow in the top right of any episode from the overview page. Under noteboards, we have something that looks a lot like this, but we can have our own separate noteboards. We can add more of those if we'd like. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then under settings, we have some settings, and one of those settings are manage noteboards, where I can create a noteboard for notes, or I could create a noteboard for, like episode ideas or guest list for future guests you might be planning on inviting to your show. And then I can save it and I'll have more noteboards. So let's start at the overview and let's talk about templating out our episode. I really think you should use this tool. I do have a referral link in here, so if you click it, I will get a monetary kickback if you use this platform. However, I don't want you to feel like you have to do that. Instead, you can just type Podcast Studio Pro, completely bypass my link, and just use it yourself. I just feel strongly that you should use this. I hope that the evidence of that is that I use it myself and I helped to build it. So I wouldn't help to build something I didn't think was useful. Okay, so we want to talk about how to create repeatable templates here so that our life is easier. So we're going to right click in one of these empty squares and we're going to see that we have some cards we can add to the board underneath 101, episode 1. So most people start with a message of some kind, an intro. I like a cold open. So I'm going to select intro, speaking intro, and this is just a square green colored block that goes in here. And then I'm going to double click it and I'm going to change intro, speaking intro to cold open. Now after the cold open, I usually have music that leads into my podcast. So I'm going to right click the next one and I'm going to select intro, musical intro. And I'll double click it, and instead of having musical intro, I'll just type intro music, if I can remember how to spell. And I might right click that, and if I wanted to do anything here like clear it or undo it or whatever, I could do that here. Now I'm going to right click this one. What happens after the intro music? I've got my cold open. I've said, hey, welcome to the So-and-So podcast. I'm Tanner. Today we're going to be talking to John Smith about his new book, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to touch on XYZ topics. And that is up next, right? Your cold open is usually never longer than a minute. Maybe it's even less than 30 seconds. It's just a way to make people understand very quickly before they make a huge time investment whether or not this episode is for them. So we've got our cold open, we've got our intro music, and then we're going to jump into the actual conversation. But when we jump into a conversation, if we're doing an interview, we certainly probably don't want to jump right into the interview. We want to do some warming up, right? We want to, hey, John, how you doing? Thanks for stopping by, small talk. So I might right click this and say, all right, well, really you can select whatever block you want. They're all meaningless. They're just different colors. So you can select a color you like. So I'll select audience Q&A and I'll right click this. Or rather, I'll double click it and change this to small talk. I'm going to have some small talk with the guest before we get into the interview. Right click the next one and I'll select topic section and I'll put interview part 1. Now I'm putting part 1 because I'm planning that there's going to be some ads in the middle of my podcast because I'm going to try to monetize my podcast through ads. So I'll put interview part 1, and then I'll right click on the next one and I'll say sponsor message, because after interview part 1 is going to be our sponsor message, and I'll just leave that the way it is. Then I'll right click down here and I'll say topic section X, and we'll call this, you're probably already guessing it, interview part 2. Now, once our interview is gone, we probably want to remember to give our guests an opportunity to kind of say, hey, you were a guest here, you've got a new book or you've got a service or something. Can we make sure people know where you're from, where we can find your stuff? If we want to buy your book, where can we do that? So we'll put a little message in here. Maybe we'll select the orange one here because that's a little bit of a different color. And we'll right click or we'll double click it and select guest self-promo, so we can remember that this is the moment where we give the guest the opportunity to kind of plug their wares, so to speak, if that's relevant. And then after that, we're going to have our call to actions. So let's select, this pink one here. call to actions. I'll just say, I'll write it out, call to action. Remember, we just have a single call to action in an episode, so we're not confusing people. And then lastly, we'll have, we'll say this call to action and goodbye. So we know that this is the section in which we remind somebody we want them to review, or we want them to check out our website or follow us on Twitter, whatever it is, call to action and hey, farewell. And then we'll have an outro here, and we'll just call it musical outro. Now, this means that we know every episode is going to follow this same template. We're going to have a cold open. We're going to have some intro music. Then we're going to have some small talk with the guest. We're going to jump into the interview. We're going to have a sponsor message or an ad of some kind, and maybe there's more than one, and if there is, that you could put two here, where you can combine two into a single one. Interview part 2, some guest self-promo, a call to action and a goodbye, and then musical outro. Now, of course, the musical outro probably starts towards the end of the call to action. You know, you'd actually want that music to overlap a little bit for effect, but there you go. That's the order it happens in, and now we're done. Now we want to come up here and we want to probably title the episode. So I'll double click in this empty area and we'll just put episode title like that. And I'll highlight the text and center it like this. Now, if this is what we're going to do in every episode for 50 episodes, I'm going to come up here, I'm going to select this drop down, and I'm going to save it as the Pretend Fantasy default. Or we'll just call it the Pretend PF template. Or Pretend Fantasy. Maybe that's easier to see. And I hit save. Now when I hit save, it saves it as a template, and I can now hit the drop-down arrow for 102 and hit Pretend Fantasy, and bam, all of that loads up. That's great, because I don't have to recreate those things all over again. So if I hit Control-Z, or undo up here, it will take those away. I can get rid of them. Now, there are pre-designed templates here, like scripted fiction, solo host, interview, listener Q&A, but I would encourage you to build your own as you see your podcast flowing. However you want to design it, make your own. Now, if we jump into this by hitting either the arrow here or going to episodes and selecting 101, first let's pick a title. We'll call it Fantasy Interview. Or maybe Pretend Interview is better. I get so specific about things that aren't real. It doesn't matter what this is called. Pretend Interview. Sticking with the theme. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit this arrow here. Again, same as clicking here, but I'm going to hit this arrow because that's what I'm used to doing. And now it opens up another page. We're in the episode screen now. And so now all of our blocks are to the left, same as they were, and now we have blocks to the right that we can fill in. So what I'll do is I'll right-click Cold Open. I'll select Create a Card. The font starts out as 20. I think that's a little too big, so I like to change the font size to more like 10 or 11. And I'll say, welcome back to the Pretend Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tanner Campbell. And today we're going to be interviewing a pretend monster from a pretend place because this is a pretend show. That's up next. Now this could be as long or as short as you'd like it to be. Like I said, between 30 seconds and a minute for a cold open. This is probably a 20-second read if it's even that long. And now I can just click outside of it. And now I've got the cold open right next to, or I've got the text for the cold open next to cold open. Now, intro music, I could right-click on this and I could create a card, and I could create a link maybe to the intro music, to the music used. But for the intro music, I'm not going to actually write anything there because nothing's happening with the intro music. The intro music is just playing. So let's go ahead and delete that, clear that out so it's just blank. So now we've got small talk. Well, maybe for this interview, for this pretend interview, I've come up with some questions ahead of time to kind of be like icebreaker questions. So maybe even change the name Small Talk to Icebreaker or something, but you know what it means. So I'll right click in here and I'll say, maybe I found an image of our guest and it's a funny image. So I'll click on this one right here. and then I'll open it. And there's no image here, but I'm going to drag and drop an image there, select one. I'll just select this picture of me, this drawing of me. And I'll change again the font to like a 10. And I'll say, hey, whatever the pretend person's name is. Hey, John. Thanks for agreeing to be on the show. It's great to have you. And then John will obviously reply and say something. So maybe we'll do a little break there. So I've got this photo of you. It was taken, it seems, on top of a volcano. Want to tell me a little bit about that? Now, you don't have to script it this specifically. I like to script very specifically because I like to be very specific. But you could just say, ask him about this photo or something like that. And now, obviously, John is going to have a response to that. So we could just put a couple dots there, line break down there, and we'll say, follow up conversation for a few minutes after answer, then slide into interview. So you've got a general idea of what you're doing. Now, this doesn't all fit on one page, so maybe I would highlight it and I would change this to 9 instead, and so it gets a little bit smaller. Well, 9 and 10 are quite different. But there you go. Now it's a little smaller. I can see it all on one page, or without having to scroll, I mean. And so now I've got that next to small talk interview part 1, right click, create this kind of card. Again, change the font to something that's a little bit more manageable. Let's use a 10. And then I could have my questions here. Question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. These are all imaginary things. Question 4. And I would have all of this in front of me so that very easily, while I'm having the conversation and recording, maybe we're using video, maybe we're not, I have this up and maybe I have it over to the side. So I can see John if I'm using something like Riverside or Squadcast or what have you. I can see John at the same time right next to it without me having to look down or anything. I have got the questions ready. And if you have a silent keyboard, as you're asking these questions, you might type in follow-up thoughts when he speaks. But, you probably shouldn't do that. You should, like I said, have a little journal that you can write in. So have a little pad of paper next to you and a pencil or a pen so you can say, oh, he said that and I thought of this. I don't want to lose that thought, but I don't want to interrupt him. Don't interrupt interviews. It's really bad for him. So I think at this point you kind of get it. Maybe the sponsor message is the script from your sponsor that they asked you to read, so you put it in here. And then there's interview part 2, so there's all the questions. You would just, I'll go ahead and copy this. And I'll just go ahead and paste it here. So we'll just say there's more questions here. Guest self-promo. We're not going to put anything here unless the guest has asked us specifically to do things. So maybe the guest will say, hey, you know what? It would actually be really cool if you could mention my new book during the self-promo because I think it's weird if I say it. I'd rather have you say it. So you could put some text there if you wanted to. And then there's your goodbye and call to action. So we open this up and we'll say, hey, again, we'll change the font size because 20 is too big for me. We'll say, hey, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with John, the imaginary imaginary monster. Next week, we'll be chatting with Becky, the groundskeeper at Monsters, Inc. Sorry, Disney, don't sue me for that. This is a different Monsters, Inc. This is Monsters Global, Inc. There we go. We don't want to get in trouble. Monsters Global, Inc. And then you can write some more on what you're going to say goodbye, and you leave it here. You remember your own call to actions, if there is one there. Like, for example, there should be one there. Actually, there's almost one hidden in here because we're kind of teasing the next week, so that's almost like a call to action itself. Don't forget to come back. But you might say, so we'll see you next time. And by the way, If you've not yet reviewed this podcast, I'd sure appreciate it if you did. And you can find links to do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, and podchaser.com in the show notes of this episode. Thanks again for listening. Take care. So we have our whole goodbye and outro. Now this is nice, right? Because I just have this here in front of me. I'm not going to lose my place. I don't have to keep it all in my mind. I know that it's here, and that's helpful. It makes my life easier. So you don't have to use this tool. Like I said, you could use any tool to do this. I mean, if we opened up Google Docs, or just Google Drive, I guess. Sure, Google Drive. If we opened up Google Drive, we could create a new Google Doc. And it's not that we couldn't do the same thing here for free. I mean, if you're trying to save money, you can do the same thing here. Probably a little bit harder to create a template because I don't believe Google Docs has that feature built in. But, there's also ClickUp, which I bought and never use. I always do that kind of thing. There's also ClickUp, which has a pretty decent free offering, and you could definitely do templating and planning with the free version of ClickUp, although this is more project management oriented and less writing organizational oriented. So maybe Evernote, which I think also has a free offering. But again, I use Podcast Studio Pro. I really enjoy it. I would love it if you used it as well. But you can create templates in other ways. You don't have to spend money to get Podcast Studio Pro to make your templates. But as you can tell, I like it a lot. Use it for my shows. And hopefully after seeing this brief walkthrough, you'll feel like, hey, there's some benefit here. And I can see how being this organized could really help me create a much better podcast. So there is, again, it's an affiliate link that is in the down below so that you can click and go get this yourself. However, if you don't want me to get a financial kickback, that's totally fine with me. I mean, it's just the only link I have. You can just go to podcaststudiopro.com, totally get around that and sign up yourself, and nobody will ever know it came from me. You and I will know. That's what's important, and you'll have a cool way to stay organized. So that is an example of how you can create some templating as far as writing is concerned, and we'll move on to talk about other kinds of templating in the next video. Thanks.